Girolamo Savonarola, Part 3. Chapter 14. A new course of sermons awakens papal displeasure. We must return to the early winter of 1496, when the choice of a Lenten preacher was uppermost in the minds of Savonarola's friends. Through their persistent efforts they succeeded in securing permission from Pope Alexander that he might resume his sermons. He was immediately chosen to speak in the Duomo during the entire Lent. The holy season opened with the cathedral thronged, a special provision having been made to accommodate the multitude eager to hear the restored preacher. Guarded by his friends, Savonarola proceeded to the church. Even then his life was in danger, for the Arrabbiati were determined to assassinate him. Mounting the pulpit, he yielded to the inspiration of the scene. Clearly, solemnly, tenderly, he proclaimed his Catholic faith and his unswerving loyalty to the Holy See, with whose permission he had resumed his preaching. The discourse was a splendid effort, a demonstration, if one were needed, that Savonarola was an orator of marvelous power. He defended his attitude towards the summons to Rome. He defied his enemies. He lashed the vices and crimes that were stalking abroad in the land. He denounced superstition. He pointed out the dangers of mere ceremonies and external observances when faith was dead. He pleaded for a renewal of the spiritual life, for perseverance by those who had already entered on the penitential way. Thus he continued during Lent. Some of his utterances as to coming plagues and the ruin and desecration of churches were afterwards fulfilled. His courage was admirable, but his enemies were increasing. Too many had felt the sting of his lash. Too many saw themselves in a hideous reflection as he held before Florence the mirror of the Christian life. Moreover, his strained relations with the Pope stripped him somewhat of the old-time power, while his distinctions as to a collision between the conscience and a superior's command bred among his hearers suspicions and evil thoughts. Though he manifested in the discourses which bore on politics, which were dictated by motives of patriotism, a lofty freedom from party spirit, this did not save him from the growing anger of the opponents of the new government, who were resolved on vengeance against him. Contentions arose, in consequence, among the partisans and factions dividing the city. Letters, ballads, pamphlets in high praise of the friar, and equally strong denunciation, multiplied and were spread among the people. Learned and ignorant, cleric and layman, taking part in the battle of words. The element of politics was the chief consideration with the great body of the Florentines. Even among many of Savonarola's followers, the bond was mainly political. That they supported the friar, as against the Pope, was not from religious sympathy or from a clear, conscientious understanding of the quarrel. They saw in Alexander a temporal ruler who wished to injure the Republic by restoring the Medici, as a preliminary step to other political and selfish ends. Therefore they upheld the friar. This fact must be clearly kept in view at this critical juncture in Savonarola's affairs. Remembering that the Pope's permission for the resumption of his sermons had been merely verbal, and considering that it had been granted in the hope that the preacher would modify his tone, we may readily believe that as the Lent advanced, as reports of Savonarola's discourses reached Alexander, his indignation was warranted. He expressed in vigorous language the displeasure he felt, and complained of the Florentine signories' upholding of Savonarola, and of their refusal to join the League of Italian States. Always politics. So entangled with this ever-recurring question of politics is the career of Savonarola that contradictions may well be admitted as almost necessary in the judgments passed by history on Pope and Friar, and on the motives actuating their relations. In the meantime, Alexander had called a conference of 14 Dominican theologians, to whom he submitted the case of Savonarola. Nothing came of it. Chief among the charges alleged was one imputing to Savonarola all the misfortunes of Piero de' Medici. Assuredly here we have a new proof that politics and not religion dominated the situation. 15. Missionary and literary labors during 1496. Renewed contention with the Pope. After Easter 1496, Savonarola proceeded to Prato, in which city the Dominican convent, as we have already mentioned, had been placed under his jurisdiction. His stay in Prato was short, but his teaching bore abundant fruit. In May he resumed his labors in Florence. He preached chiefly on Sundays and published 2 volumes, one on the simplicity of the Christian life, in which he presented Catholic truths in a style so easy that all who ran might read. The other volume contained an exposition of the 79th Psalm. Give ear, O thou that rulest Israel, thou that leadest Joseph like a sheep. From May until late in August he continued at intervals his impassioned sermons, which warnings and menacings of the future retribution were repeated often. He was entirely divested of all human fear. On August 20th he preached in the hall of the Grand Council, and there, before the Signory, the other officials, and the leading men of Florence, he defended himself against the slurs of the enemies who had impugned his motives, and who, by dishonestly charging him with undue interference in public affairs, had slandered him. At this time, the Republic being in sore straits, the powerful influence of Savonarola was eagerly sought by the authorities, and, despite the ingratitude which he had already experienced, he generously devoted his time to the strengthening of the government among the people. With rare prudence he avoided giving the pontiff any further occasion for irritation. In fact, during 2 months and more he abstained from preaching. It was late in October when he again ascended the pulpit. Great misery prevailed in the city, and the unfortunate people turned to the prior in the hope of some relief. He encouraged them, comforted them, and to win special favor from heaven, he organized a grand procession in honor of the Blessed Virgin. The image of the Madonna del Impruneta having been brought into the city, the Florentines, who especially venerated Our Lady under this title, manifested an extraordinary devotion. While the procession was in progress, news came that much-needed supplies were at hand. Considering this as a sign of heavenly favor, the fickle multitude again hailed Savonarola as their deliverer. On All Saints and All Souls, Savonarola again preached. 5 days later the Pope issued another brief, in which he took a stand entirely different from that of his previous order, regarding the union of the Tuscan and the Lombard provinces of the order. By this latest letter he commanded the Florentine and Tuscan Dominicans to unite in one province with those of the Roman congregation, under a vicar who would be immediately subject to the Master General of the order. In answer to this brief, Savonarola published an apology in which he contended that the Pope had been misinformed, and that to carry out his command would be to the detriment of religion. Frankly, we can offer no excuse for Savonarola's action in this crisis. Forgetting his previous declaration that he would obey, though the ruin of the world followed, he refused to carry out the injunctions of Alexander. And yet the command of the Pope was not only within his right, waiving all questions of motive, but it was his further right, had he so desired, to suppress the province over which Savonarola ruled, or the entire order of which he was a member. Had the prior of St. Mark's obeyed, yielding up his authority and becoming subject to the new jurisdiction, he might have been transferred from Florence, where he believed his presence necessary. He might have been silenced, he might have been persecuted, but worse he could not have befallen him than awaited him in ungrateful Florence, nor would he have lost the victory which is ever promised to the obedient man. The 26th of November found him again in the pulpit. He continued to preach during Advent, giving a marked political character to his discourses, and sounding a note of defiance that meant no retreat, no surrender. This alone would have placed him in a false position. A semblance of power he held, but the plots, forgeries, and slanders of his enemies, together with his own defiance of the Pope, were already paving the way for the end of his seeming triumph. When the year 1496 closed, his position was one of great peril. 16. The plots of the friar's enemies, the burnings of the vanities, 1497. As the Lent of 1497 drew near, the Arrabbiati, and especially the younger portion of them, many of whom had banded together and were known as the Compagnacci, determined to cast off the restraints which Savonarola's reform had put upon their amusements. It is apparent that the prior had not sufficiently consulted the reasonable weaknesses of human nature, and so his advice and rules concerning entertainments bore the stamp of excessive severity. Against these, the bad fellows not only rebelled, but they also resolved to go to the other extreme, reviving the shameful practices which had been in vogue during the Medicean rule. Savonarola was on the alert, and was ably seconded by his devoted disciple, Father Dominic, who preached daily, while the prior occupied himself in the composition and publication of various pamphlets, the final draft of his book on the Triumph of the Cross. The Arrabbiati and the Compagnacci were defeated, and by a peculiar device, as we shall now see. Once more Savonarola won the children, who paraded the city for several days before the carnival, making a novel collection from the people already disposed, through the sermons of Savonarola and Father Dominic, to surrender vain and sinful objects. A large quantity of miscellaneous articles were secured. Preparations had been made in the piazza, where an enormous pyramid had been erected, 60 feet in height, divided, as Bermacci Berlamacci relates, into 15 tiers, or as another contemporary reports, into 7, symbolizing the 7 deadly sins. The interior of the pyramid was filmed with inflammable material. We follow Berlamacci as to the disposition of the articles which had been collected by the children. On the first step were laid the foreign tapestries on which obscene figures had been wrought. On the second were pictures of Florentine damsels, and other representations. On the next there were cards, dice, gambling implements. On the fourth were musical instruments. Then came the women's adornments, false hair, perfumes, lotions, powders, etc. After these were placed copies of the profane poets and some of the modern writers, Boccaccio and others. Finally, a great quantity of carnival finery, masks, costumes, etc. Surmounting all was a figure of King Carnival. The news had spread rapidly, and the curiosity and excitement of the Florentines were aroused to a high pitch. In great numbers the people assembled, and after religious exercises in the morning, mass and communion by all the children, and a grand procession, during which a generous collection in money had been made for the good men of St. Martin. Suddenly, at 4 points the pile was fired, and while the air was filled with the sweet song of the children, the huge pyramid was consumed. Probably no event in Savonarola's career has excited more bitter condemnation than this burning of the vanities. Exaggeration, both by friends and opponents, had so exalted the value and the nature of the stuff destroyed that it is difficult to arrive at a certain conclusion. The alleged offer, by a Venetian who was present, of 20,000 crowns for the articles on the pyramid had something to do with the erroneous notions prevailing as to the quality of the vanities. In consequence, Savonarola had been denounced as a barbarous hater of the arts, an iconoclast, a gloomy fanatic opposed to all innocent enjoyment. The old complaint of Judas, "Why were not these things sold and their price given to the poor?" had also been brought against the friar. These objections have been satisfactorily met. At a time famous for its scholars, many of whom witnessed this burning under the direction of a man who was himself a poet, whose convent was a sanctuary of art, whose most devoted friends were the painters and sculptors of the day, it is not likely that any really precious article was destroyed. In burning obscenely illustrated volumes, some rare editions may have been destroyed. Among the paintings there have been some inferior works of eminent artists, but the bulk of the vanities was composed of masks, wigs, beards, toilet articles, etc. Cheap stuff whose sale would have brought little for the poor, of whom Savonarola had always taken good care. In proof of his positive statement that art had not suffered by this burning, and as a testimony to the noble and generous spirit of the scholarly prior of St. Mark's, Villari refers to the purchase by Savonarola of the Medician library, under circumstances of peculiar honor to the friar and his brethren, who stripped themselves of many of their possessions, and burdened themselves with debt to keep intact this splendid collection, and to preserve it for Florence. At the same time, Savonarola was, in this special instance, the financial mainstay of the government, which was passing through a period of great stringency. Here, then, writes Villari, is historical proof that the supposed enemy of the ancients, the barbarous destroyer of manuscripts and works of art, not only devoted the last remnant of his convent's property, but likewise burdened the community with a very heavy debt in order to preserve to art and science the marvelous collection of Greek and Latin codices, and the unrivaled treasure of miniatures still contained in the Laurentian library. Anticipating, as we may, we shall here refer to the second burning which took place in 1498. It differed but little from the burning of the previous year, though the preliminary procession and the begging of alms for the good men of St. Martin were interrupted by the Campagnacci, who insulted the Piagnoni, and in various offensive and injurious ways proved their right to their ugly title. Speaking of this burning, Villari quotes Nardi, a lover of antiquity, a scholar and historian who declares that many dishonest, indecent, and vain things were burned, and Somensi, an enemy of Savonarola, who wrote that the pile consisted of a great quantity of lustful things, mirrors, women's false hair, masks, paintings, quantities of perfumes, and every species of lustful things. It is likely, asks Villari, that if really valuable objects of art had been included in this collection, the learned Nardi and Somensi, the bitter enemy of Savonarola, would have failed to mention the fact. (17) Alexander VI excommunicates Savonarola. The Lent of 1497 practically closed the effective preaching of Savonarola. Though his difficulty with Alexander VI was approaching an acute stage, and though he continued to denounce abuses, he made it clear to all that he questioned no dogma of the Church, and that he not only recognized the supreme spiritual dominion of Rome, but also that he was a loyal upholder of the temporal sovereignty of the Holy See. Expecting, as it would seem, the excommunication which later fell on him, he showed a spirit of strange courage or defiance. Again he referred to his violent death, as he foresaw it, and cheerfully offered his life as a sacrifice. Political questions in which Alexander was deeply concerned still held a place in the dispute. To the Florentines he made overtures regarding Pisa, which were not accepted. For this he rebuked their ambassador, affirming that the Republic resisted him because of their faith in the friar, who, as he declared, had insulted the Holy See. In Rome intrigues were incessant among Piero de' Medici's adherents, one of whose most devoted followers was the friar Mariano, who had been humiliated in Florence and who had transferred his residence to Rome, where he kept up his spiteful opposition to Savonarola. In Florence plots were hatched, and desperate efforts were made to arouse a sentiment in favor of a return of Piero, who was planning to enter the city by force. He failed ignominiously. Savonarola had predicted his humiliating retreat. The Campagnacci were foremost among those who sought the downfall of the prior as a preliminary to the downfall of the Republic. They had resolved on his assassination. They resorted to the most disgraceful and cowardly tactics to harass him. They profaned the Duomo in a shameful and filthy manner. His Ascension Day sermon they sacrilegiously interrupted. They tried to precipitate a riot, and when he fearlessly stood in the pulpit, vainly endeavoring to make himself heard above the noise, the wretches attempted to kill him. It seems almost incredible that Alexander could have sanctioned such an outrage. Yet the charge is made against him, without the offer of any proof except of another unproved charge that he had been withholding a brief of excommunication, awaiting the result of Piero's expedition and of the plot against Savonarola. 9 days after the Ascension Sermon, the excommunication was launched. The document, however, had not reached Florence on the 22nd, nor was it then known, except by way of foreboding, when Savonarola addressed to Alexander a conciliatory letter, appealing against his enemies, and referring to his forthcoming book, The Triumph of the Cross, for a justification of his teaching. His effort was unavailing. By the end of the month this document had arrived in Florence, ambiguous in its terms, irregular in form, served in an unusual manner. On 2 points, however, there can be no dispute. Alexander charged Savonarola with disobedience in the affair of the Tuscan congregation already related, but he did not charge him with heresy. Repeating the former style of reference to a certain friar, Jerome, said to be vicar, etc., Alexander declared that from reports that the friar was suspected of heresy. This, however, availed little. A terrible blow fell on Savonarola when, by mid-June, the papal edict had been solemnly promulgated, to be followed by all the attending misfortunes awaiting one with whom no Christian could hold communion. The effect of such a measure cannot be estimated by those unfamiliar with the dreadful consequences involved in the infliction of the penalties of last ecclesiastical resort. Savonarola bowed before the storm, kept within his cloister, but in a declaration to all Christians in the love of God, he defended himself and denied the justice and validity of the excommunication. In the meantime, the Combagnacci had asserted themselves, and Florence, true to the lowest instinct of ungrateful humanity, resumed its course of evil as in the worst days from which Savonarola had rescued it. Within a month the city was the scene of every manner of disorder, the vile rabble even going the length of stoning the convent of St. Mark's. For this offense they were not punished by the Signory, then in power, which contained a majority opposed to Savonarola. During July and August, however, a new election brought the prior's friends to the front, and then began a series of the most earnest efforts on the part of Signori, on the Florentine ambassadors of Rome, and of influential followers of Savonarola to secure the repeal of the brief of excommunication. The Brethren of St. Mark's and the hundreds of the leading citizens of Florence signed petitions begging the absolution for Savonarola, and bearing testimony to the holiness of his life and doctrine. It was all in vain. His enemies were powerful, and their activity was unceasing. As July advanced, the plague, which had broken out, spread rapidly, though it spent its force before the end of August. While it continued, Savonarola, although unable to minister spiritually to the afflicted because of his excommunication, was unsparing in his efforts to succor them through material aid, counsel, encouragement, letters of guidance, and pamphlets of practical instruction, and by the example of his own unfaltering attitude. "28. A calumny answered. Disobedience of the friar. The Pope threatens an interdict. The cessation of the pestilence and the consequent resumption of the usual course of affairs afforded the government an opportunity to take up the case of those who had been suspected of complicity in the recent attempt of Piero de' Medici to regain his hold on the Republic. As the result of an exciting trial, 5 distinguished citizens were sentenced to death. In the matter of this conspiracy and trial, Savonarola has been grievously calumniated. As Villari pointedly remarks, neither in the histories, memoirs, correspondence, or biographies of the period do we find a single word to indicate whether Savonarola was favorable or unfavorable to the accused. His own declaration is in evidence that he had deprecated the death penalty for the leader and that he had recommended another to the consideration of friends. Nevertheless, he had been represented as denying to the condemned the right of appeal, as if the administration of law and judicial decisions rested with him. In this charge there were 2 errors. The guilt of the conspirators having been conclusively proved, after an exhaustive and protracted trial with which Savonarola had no connection whatever, he could not have saved them on an appeal, even had he made the attempt, because the patriotic passion was running too high to suffer any check, even from the friar. The further assertion that the law of appeal denied to the condemned was of his making is one of those half-truths which are often worse than whole lies. Savonarola, as we have narrated in its proper place, had striven to secure the establishment of a court of appeal, not the final reference of judicial cases to a mob. The autumn of 1497 was passing, and Savonarola, silent and withdrawn from the public eye, labored with extraordinary diligence in the composition and publication of various spiritual works, letters, tracts, pamphlets, for religious and for the laity. Toiling tirelessly, he published a small library of these treatises in an incredibly short time. He also finished his great book, The Triumph of the Cross, which, though based on St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa contra Gentiles, is one of the earliest attempts made by a theologian to treat religion from the viewpoint of reason. In this work he proved that he was a deep thinker. He manifested great courage in disregarding the beaten paths of his day, while his fidelity to the angelic doctor, his vast learning, and his undoubted orthodoxy made the volume his Catholic monument. Beginning with the existence of God and the necessity of religion, he proceeds to the Christian revelation, passes to its doctrines and sacraments, and concludes with a refutation of opposing and contradictory creeds. Had men seriously doubted the great preacher's loyal Catholicity, this volume, a pioneer of a new school of spiritual literature, in matter most solid and excellent, in style most original, would have been an explicit and satisfactory answer. Neither heretic nor schismatic was Savonarola. No more devoted son of the Roman See ever labored for God and souls, despite his unhappy collision with Alexander VI. All other efforts at reconciliation having failed, the Republic having exhausted all its influence, Pico della Mirandola published an apology for the friar in which he showed much learning, but he failed to touch the main point, the duty of obedience to a command, even though the most unworthy motive animate the superior. History, as usually written, may not absolve Alexander from the gratuitous charge of harboring sentiments of personal animosity toward Savonarola, nor is it likely to free him from another charge, having used the spiritual weapons of the Church in an affair from which politics could not be separated. The domain of motive and conscience is here entered without sufficient external light to guide the inquirer. Judgment, therefore, should at least be suspended. It is not also evident that an impartial judgment must deplore the error of Savonarola, who allowed himself to take a false stand through excessive zeal? In celebrating Mass on Christmas 1497, and in preaching on Septuagesima Sunday 1498, while under the ban of excommunication, Savonarola probably acted on the dictates of a conscience which may have grown certain in the conviction that his excommunication was unjust and invalid. Nevertheless, we deplore this step as a blunder worse than a crime. It proved to be the beginning of the end. He pleaded his cause ably, but the tide had set strongly against him and was flowing fast. 3 times subsequently he spoke before the end of the carnival, which he closed with the second burning of the Vanity. It was on this day that, holding aloft the Blessed Sacrament, he solemnly called God to destroy him if he had ever spoken falsely to the people. The report of these happenings was carried to Rome, where powerful enemies were engaged in a final effort to overcome the friar. Alexander's anger was natural, for seldom had a pope been deified in such manner. He was also incensed against the Republic for its advocacy and support of the daring friar. The contention was further inflamed by Father Mariano, who preached a violent and opprobrious sermon against Savonarola, though his evident malice and gross buffoonery won for him only increased contempt and reprobation. From this, however, he derived fresh zeal in his malignant pursuit of a man who had never injured him. On February 26th, Alexander wrote to the Signory, and commanded them to stop Savonarola's preaching, and either to send him to Rome or to imprison him in Florence. The brief closed with the threat of an interdict on the city. But the Signory were not moved. The canons of the cathedral, however, also received a command to prevent the friar from speaking in the Duomo. Accordingly, he withdrew to St. Mark's, where his audience was so great that a special day was set for the exclusive attendance of women. The election for March and April returned a majority of the Signory opposed to Savonarola. It is puzzling, therefore, to find these men writing to Alexander in behalf of the prior. Villari inclines to the opinion that their purpose was still further to vex and irritate the Pope. Savonarola continued his sermons on the reformation of the Church and on the need of a council. Reading these discourses after 400 years, it must be admitted that Alexander showed considerable patience. Some writers call this patience cunning and duplicity. But even were it so, the condition of affairs had now come to such a pass that the end was only a question of a short time. Repeatedly the Pope warned the Florentine government that he would brook no further delay. He had grown tired of words. He demanded deeds, and not until these deeds were accomplished would he consider favorably the Republic's request regarding Pisa and the proposed taxation of church property. He denied that he had been misinformed. He admitted the good works and correct teaching of Savonarola, but he also insisted on his submission and obedience. On receiving these he would absolve him and allow him to resume his place in the pulpit. Otherwise he would at once interdict the city. During this time, the month of March, Piero de' Medici was active in Rome, securing cooperation for the decisive moment when he should again attempt to regain control in Florence. The other enemies of Savonarola were incessant in their plotting, while the Venetians and the Milanese, encouraged by Alexander, were seeking, if possible, to force the Florentines into their league. Politics dominated and confused the minds of the friends and foes of the friar. Many of his friends grew timid, especially when the threatened interdict was held over their heads. Commercial and financial considerations also had great weight, for an interdict meant the business ruin of a city while it continued in force. It was not, therefore, religion or loyalty to the Pope, but selfish material interests that won to Alexander's side a majority of the government, now ready to sacrifice the friar who had done so much and so generously for the city was about to abandon him. On March 15th, Savonarola, as if urged to make a last appeal directly to the Pope, wrote to Alexander a letter full of affection and courage. Fearing, he said, that no hope could be entertained of a revocation of the decree of excommunication, he must therefore appeal to God, for whom he was ready, longing to lay down his life. And he closed by warning Alexander to consider his ways, and not to delay the affair of his salvation. On the 17th he preached in St. Mark's, and on the evening of the same day he received a communication from the Signory requesting him to discontinue his sermons. He told the messengers that his answer would be given on the next day. On the 18th Savonarola delivered his farewell discourse, crowning in sorrow and humiliation, though still deeper depths were in waiting, an unexampled career of devotion to the best interests of Florence, a devotion manifested in the marvelous sermons during 8 years, and in the numerous good works which he had blessed the Republic. The Trial by Fire, 1498. Savonarola's efforts to secure the summoning of a council for the reformation of the Church and for the disposition of Alexander VI must not be judged in the light of our day. The wounds inflicted by the great schism of the West, the Church still bore in her body. The notions prevailing as to the power of a council were then exaggerated. Peculiar also were the views held by more than one king. The monstrous evils which Savonarola clearly saw and bitterly felt seemed to him to justify his appeal to the Catholic sovereigns of England, Germany, France, Spain, and Hungary. Moreover, he relied on the cardinals, many of whom, notably Cardinal of St. Peter and Chains, were strongly opposed to Alexander, and had seemed anxious to secure his deposition or resignation. The letters prepared for the monarchs were not sent. Preliminary correspondence, however, had been arranged through friends in the different countries. These communications were sufficiently clear to outline the bold plan contemplated by Savonarola. Unfortunately, the courier carrying the packet intended for the Florentine ambassador in France was seized by spies of the Duke of Milan, who, to win favor with Alexander, at once sent to Rome the incriminating documents. Savonarola's doom was sealed. Alone he could not contend with success against the mighty power of his combined foes. He declined, nevertheless, to attempt escape, resolved to meet his fate in the same lofty spirit which he had invited it. The majority of those holding political power in Florence completely turned against him, and even the Franciscans, who in their history of their institute had ever been affectionately united with the Dominicans, contributed an antagonist to swell the growing number of the unhappy prior's enemies. On the rapidly increasing misfortunes of a brave and unselfish man, prematurely worn with fasting, labor, suffering, and care, a miserable culmination was put, before the tragic ending, by the precipitation of a abortive trial by fire. Friar Francis de Puglia is the name of the man who has achieved an unenviable notoriety as a challenger of Savonarola to the wretched and barbarous device of the trial. After vilifying the prior in an unchristian manner, Francis had the audacity to summon him to the ordeal by fire, through which the Franciscan declared his readiness to prove the great Dominican a heretic and a false prophet. Savonarola had previously been annoyed by such challenges, but he had always ignored them, despising the barbarity as well as the unreasonableness of such proofs. He treated the arrogant Franciscan in a like manner. Here the matter might have ended, in deserved contempt, had it not been for Father Dominic, who came forward and recognized the Franciscan as one who, during the previous year, had challenged him to a dispute and then had run away. On behalf of Savonarola, Father Dominic took up the gauntlet which Father Francis had thrown down. Again he proved recreant. Pretending that he had no cause with Father Dominic, and that with Savonarola he could only deal, he hastily took advantage of the way thus opened for him to escape. But Father Dominic pursued the case with great eagerness, despite the warning and reproval of Savonarola, who wished him to pay no further attention to the affair. The Compagnacci then became interested, and used their influence with the Signory to push the matter, so that the people might enjoy a spectacle. This would have afforded a desirable opportunity for these dissolute young men to raise a tumult, in the confusion which they would either seize Savonarola or kill him. A real ordeal was not desired by either the Signory or the Compagnacci. The Franciscan seems to have understood that he would not be in danger, even if some of the Dominicans were burned. Nevertheless, he provided, like many patriots, a substitute. The arrangements, however, dragged slowly. It was the end of March before they were concluded. Alexander had heard of the contemplated ordeal, but he did not prohibit the exhibition. He had other cares. Despite his good judgment, which condemned such a senseless encounter, despite the fact that he strenuously opposed the ordeal, Savonarola felt that God would vindicate the brethren of St. Mark's against whom much bitterness has been aroused. The government openly favored the Franciscans. This injustice only excited the zeal of Savonarola's followers, among whom not only were several hundred friars found ready to volunteer to undergo the terrible trial, but many laymen and even women. Of this striking fact the Pope was made aware through a letter sent to him bearing exclusively on the extraordinary demonstration. Savonarola published a statement and defense against his accusers, for his slanderers hesitated at no untruth. Obliged to take action, he took it boldly. He declared that for every friar minor who would appear at the trial of a Dominican champion would be ready. The 6th of April was the day assigned for the ordeal. On the 5th, St. Mark's community received notice of a postponement to the 7th. The Dominicans who had been enthusiastic for the contest felt disappointed, but stood ready for the 7th. Despite the assurances given to them of immunity from danger, despite the grievous penalties which had been decreed against their opponents in case of failure, the Franciscans demanded still further guarantees. These were granted in the form of a resolution by the Signory, which provided that if Father Dominic perished in the flames, Savonarola would be banished within 3 hours. How absurd it all seems! How barbarous and unchristian! Yet these were times of a certain refinement, of much learning, of great faith, but also, alas, of great superstition, of shameful depravity, of legal methods that remind us of savages, and men, even of Savonarola's stature, were, to an extent, under the spell. It is not necessary to dwell in further detail on this farcical ordeal. The Dominicans attended, the Franciscans appeared after much delay, and then, with various unworthy quibbles and tricky subterfuges, the day passed. There was no spectacle. The disappointed throngs that had stood for hours, eager to witness the barbarous ordeal, dispersed with anger in their hearts against Savonarola, who had not faltered, but, mob-like, with applause for his opponents, who had shirked the contest in a cowardly fashion, every concession finding them still more reluctant to meet the adversaries whom they had challenged to the trial. Human nature in Florence, as the world over, in the waning days of the 15th century, as in the period of refined and delicate civilization, which the 19th claims as its own, was proving its title to littleness, ingratitude, and cruelty. Escorted by devoted adherents who defended them with drawn swords, and it was necessary, the Dominicans found their return to St. Mark's a difficult and perilous journey. The Compagnaci were nimble in insult and outrage, and, of course, the mob joined them. But the gallant followers of Marsuccio Salviati, whose resolute threat that he would cut down any man who crossed the line of safety he had drawn around his revered friars, was well understood. Conducted to St. Mark's, the prior and his brethren, who had been subjected to so mortifying a deception by the infamous plotters, and their tools, the misguided miners. In a few days the Compagnaci and all the other enemies of the now helpless and doomed victim were able to celebrate a triumph which was the beginning of Florence's downfall. The death of the friar, said Pope Julius II, preceded by a few years the death of the Republic.